This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 450, entitled Masculisting the Divorce Court Lawyers and Judges. Description. This flyer offers the carrot and the stick to monoconscious, fluffy feminist-controlled divorce court lawyers and judges by threatening them with the stick of being murdered by hateful masculist soldiers in a sex war, or the carrot by studying masculist and MGTOW ideas so that they become biconscious and hence motivated to menfair the divorce courts and gender laws in general, so that they lower the hatred level of masculist soldiers, so that millions of men are liberated from the horrors of the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts via the creation of a FIP Society where all women are FIPs and not fluffy, manslaving parasites of men. The flyer itself. Masculisting the Divorce Court Lawyers and Judges by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. When President Lincoln was introduced to Harriet Beecher Stowe, the authoress of the famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which so vividly portrayed the horrors of Negro slavery in the southern states of the US in the first half of the 1800s, his opening remark to her was, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." This remark was no exaggeration, since Lincoln was a very tall man of 6 foot 4 inches in height, and she was short even by female standards. By the Great War, Lincoln meant the US Civil War, which had already been raging for a year when they met in 1862. Stowe published her famous book in 1852, a mere 9 years before the US Civil War broke out. It was a massive bestseller, particularly in Europe, where there was no copyright agreement across the Atlantic, so European publishers were free to publish it at will. Stowe's vivid portrayal of the cruelties and brutality of Negro slavery caused many northern state US citizens to learn to hate Negro slavery, and caused many southern state US citizens to hate Stowe. Why am I saying all this? Because I anticipate something similar happening with regard to man slavery that is so deeply ingrained in our current culture that it is difficult for people to see man slavery for what it is. That is a form of slavery, that is working for someone else without being paid by that someone else, which is the very definition of slavery. Masculists, that is men's libbers, are preaching to men that women have a career window of half a century, therefore have a powerful moral obligation to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, that is, become FIPs, in brackets, financially independent persons, by bothering to get a career competent education at high school and college so that they become FIPs as adults, pulling their financial weight and not expecting fluffy style, in brackets, fluffy equals a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, close brackets, to manslave him for decades, a major gender crime in the eyes of the masculists, who aim to wipe out fluffies by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, thus forcing their fluffy parasite genes to be removed from the gene pool. Masculists are abolitionists. That is, they see fluffydom as manslavery and manslavery as slavery. Since slavery is universally hated, masculists have a hatred of manslavery and hence a hatred of fluffies, and an even greater hatred of fluffy feminists, since it's bad enough that fluffy feminists are fluffies and hence manslavers, but are hypocrites as well, since fluffy feminists push for equal rights with men in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men to share equally the burdens of earning the living by not bothering to FIP up, thus manslaving some stupid, ignorant, manslavable man by living off his money and labour for decades, which is such a major gender crime in the eyes of masculists that such fluffy women are hated. Masculists aim to wipe such women off the face of the earth by totally ignoring them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at for being manslaving vermin. Slavery was the norm for thousands of years. In the 1800s, slavery was seen increasingly as a moral abomination and was abolished in many countries. In fact, the US was rather slow in getting rid of its pro-slavery laws, which happened in 1865 at the end of the US Civil War, which was largely fought over the issue of the moral abomination of Negro slavery. In the UK, on the other hand, thanks largely to the efforts of Lord Wilberforce, Negro slavery was abolished in 1807, that is nearly 60 years earlier than in the US. If it weren't for the invention of the cotton gin that allowed efficient removal of cotton seeds from the cotton, Negro slavery would probably have died out in the southern states the way it did in the northern states, but with a huge demand for cotton coming from the UK, the southern US states made a fortune exporting cheap cotton thanks to the unpaid labour of the Negro slaves. So there was powerful economic motivation to keep Negro slavery intact in the southern US states. In today's world, we live with a different kind of slavery. It takes one's masculist consciousness to be raised to even see men working for women as manslavery. We are so accustomed to this traditional male role of working for women, while women as mothers raise the children, that most people do not even question these two traditional gender roles, that is, the male breadwinner, father, husband, and the female child raiser, mother, wife. A century ago, this task distribution between the two sexes made very practical sense, since there was no cheap, effective contraception in those days, so women had routinely a dozen kids, so raising them was a full-time job. So one could not talk about manslavery in those days, since women worked full-time at child raising, as men, the fathers, worked full-time to earn money to keep his whole family, that is both his kids and his parasitic wife, financially afloat, that is, alive. However, today, we live in an entirely different world. Men have given women the contraceptive pill and other modern forms of contraception, household gadgets, science-based medicine, so that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years. So even those women who have their 2 kids and stay at home raising them while they are very small still have a career window of half a century. So now the masculists are putting enormous moral pressure on women by saying to them, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work, since anything else is manslavery, and manslavery will eventually get you killed. Since to masculists, manslavery is slavery, and slavery is hated, and a war issue." End quote. The problem is that social change does not occur overnight. There is considerable cultural inertia in society's institutions and values. This is glaringly obvious in the divorce courts, which were taken over by the fluffy feminists in the 1970s, who forced parliaments to pass legislation that created fault-free divorce. That resulted in the divorce courts, in brackets, renamed family courts, close brackets, becoming slaughterhouses for divorcing fathers. The problem with these fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts is that they are what the Masculists call monoconscious. That is, they have only had their feminist consciousness raised, so they are angry at men for the ways that men oppress women, for example, rape, sexual harassment, etc., but know nothing about masculism, so do not have their masculist consciousness raised. For example, they do not see men working for women as manslavery, but merely what men have done for women for centuries. They have no conception of the need for a that's paternity rejection right, while at the same time fighting hard for the maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, who feel no moral compulsion to FIP up, seeing men as cash machines to pay for women to have babies. The divorce courts are filled with such monoconscious feminists who often have the attitude that they can use the divorce courts to seek revenge against men's centuries-long oppression of women. So they rob and abuse men with a string of measures that make masculists murderously angry and hateful at what the masculists see as massive gender injustices against men. For example, a century ago, men worked for their kids because they kept them. But in today's world, one father in 4 will lose custody of his kids. This figure comes from the fact that half of marriages fail. That is, half of marriages end in divorce. What is less known is that in about half of these divorces, the divorcing wife turns into a vindictive feminazi bitch out to extract from her divorcing husband everything she can get from him. That is, his money, his house, his kids, his wealth, his stuff, child payments, alimony, etc. You begin to understand why the masculists see what is going on in today's divorce courts as a war issue. No culture that financially crucifies and destroys the lives of a quarter of its fathers can remain intact. Men will explode and start a sex war, with the primary and initial targets being the divorce courts, that is, the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce court lawyers and judges, killing them in their thousands. The masculists, like myself, are preaching to men that women have a career window of half a century, so must FIP up, or be severely punished by men by not getting one. This message is really getting out to men, especially young men, who now, in many countries, are refusing to marry, rejecting paternity, due to the hated monoconscious hypocrisy of the fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts. I read that in the UK, for example, young men care more about the level of fitness of a potential girlfriend than they do about her looks, which is a very strong statement. These young British men look at these potential girlfriends with a very cold eye, asking themselves, quote, "Is this woman a fluffy crapper? Did she study fluffy crap majors at high school and college? Will she be a fluffy as an adult and expect to manslave me for decades? Does she have the mentality and expectation of a fluffy? If I become convinced that she is a fluffy, then there's no way I'll have a relationship with her, since I absolutely refuse to have kids with a bloody fluffy who will strip my kids away from me with one chance in 4 to force me to pay for her for decades. I've had my masculist consciousness raised and will not tolerate being manslaved by a hated fluffy, manslaving parasite. I hate such women and agree wholeheartedly with the masculists that such women need to be annihilated from the face of the earth, forced to FIP up or eventually be killed, since manslavery is slavery, slavery is hated, so slavery is a war issue. Look at the US Civil War. That was largely about the moral abomination of Negro slavery. As a masculist, I'm an abolitionist. That is, I have a hatred against fluffy manslavery and support the drive of the masculists to menfair the gender laws, reform the divorce courts, legislate the para, etc. Millions of men, especially young men, are thinking like this now, and in ever-growing numbers. It's therefore likely that the more extreme masculists will develop such a hatred of the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts that they will start seeing the divorce courts as the primary battlefield for men, the historical equivalent of Fort Sumter, which was the site of the first shots in the US Civil War. What I'm saying here is that I consider it almost inevitable that the first shots in the sex war will be directed at the divorce courts, since it is in them that men routinely, daily, hourly have their lives ruined in their millions by monoconscious fluffy feminists who see men as cash machines to be abused and robbed. This massive gender injustice is so vast, so pervasive, that it is difficult to take in. It involves literally millions of men, a quarter of fathers, so has all the makings of a casus belli, that is, a cause for war. So that if the gender laws are not soon menfaired, I truly fear that there will be a sex war, as millions of men have their masculist consciousnesses raised, who develop a real hatred at what the fluffy feminist hypocrites are doing to millions of men, who then pick up arms and start killing fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges in their thousands, seeing their role as crusading masculist soldiers, fighting a war for men to free men from a massive affliction, from being manslaves to fluffy manslaving parasites for decades, a hugely greater gender crime against men than any gender crime that men commit against women, even rape. Even rape is small beer in comparison to decades-lasting manslavery by fluffies. Thus this flyer appeals to these fluffy feminists who control the divorce